Hey everyone, my name is Anthony Ciardelli and I'm the co-host of this new podcast we're going to call Lost Teams. You might be wondering what Lost Teams is. Well, each episode, my co-host Andrew and I, who I'm going to introduce you to in a second, are going to tell the story of a professional sports franchise that has disappeared, moved, become insolvent, no longer exists in the way it did back then. And it can be from any major sport, minor or professional. We're going to start off in North America, but we might eventually get to other countries, other parts of the world. So I'm going to introduce you to my co-host and co-creator of this podcast, Andrew Lennox. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How you doing, Anthony?
Doing really well. So Andrew, as the co-creator of this podcast, it was really your idea. I remember when you texted me the idea, I thought it was pretty cool. But what made you kind of come up with this Lost Teams podcast idea?
Well, ever since I was a kid, I've always had an interest in, vintage type sports merchandise and, hats and whatnot, mostly like hats. And that kind of turned into just researching and looking up stats for old time franchises that no longer exist.
That sounds good. I share your interest in those teams, especially when it's like they have some mind-blowing fact about a player that was on there or some sort of resulting either team moving there or a professional team taking over. So yeah, I don't blame you at all. So this first episode we're going to get into, you're going to talk a little basketball, right?
That's correct.
Awesome. And I'm going to talk a little bit of hockey. So we might as well get it started. Do you want to go first? Do you want me to go first?
Sure, I can go first.
All right. Sounds good. Well, go ahead. Kick it off.
My source for the history on the Pittsburgh Pipers, Condors and Pioneers was the Condors page at Remember the ABA.
Awesome. Sounds like an excellent site that people should check out if they want some more old sports facts. Definitely.
Tons of useless knowledge on there. I actually decided to pick a team that I'm mostly a hockey fan, but, I've always been interested in the American Basketball Association, mostly because of the movie Semi-Pro that I most recently watched. Actually, a couple of days ago. It was probably the last movie I watched. But, so I think it's loosely based on, the ABA and a franchise that was in that league. So the team I'm going to focus on is the Pittsburgh Pipers. And they were in one of the first franchises in the American Basketball Association that started in 1967. Just to go back a bit talk a little bit first about the American Basketball Association. It was a professional basketball league from 1967 to 1976. Eventually it merged with the NBA. There was, I think, 6 teams that merged to that league because the ABA was struggling. I think it ended with 6 teams, and then it started actually with I'm not sure if it started with 11 teams, but at its peak it had 11 teams.
And then every team that didn't get moved into the NBA had its own mega bowl like the Tropics did.
Yeah, there was, I think, a dispersal draft on some of the franchises that folded for players to merge into the NBA. So
that was the Hollywood happy ending. Everyone else just got the shaft and didn't get to play in the NBA pretty much.
Right. So the team actually began going into the Pipers now. The team actually began playing the ABA's first season, which was in 1967-68. And the team was actually very successful on the court. They had a regular season record of 54-2. They were actually led by a legend in the ABA, and he actually moved on to the NBA, but had some injury problems. He had most of his success in the ABA. He was an ABA legend, power forward, and future Hall of Famer Connie Hawkins. He led the ABA with 26.8 points per game, actually. So
wow.
Yeah, he was a superstar in the league. So in their first season, the team, like I said, with the 54-2 regular season record, and they were very successful on the court, I should say, and they swept through the ABA playoffs, eventually defeating the New Orleans Buccaneers. Actually, they won 4 games to 3, so it was a battle to win that first title. And actually Hawkins was the finals MVP. So he had a huge year. In their inaugural season, the Pipers averaged about 3,200 fans per game, which was okay at that time. They shared the Pittsburgh Civic Center, which was nicknamed the Igloo. So they actually shared the Igloo with the NHL's Pittsburgh Penguins. Obviously, we know a little bit about the success the Penguins had. Mario Lemieux and Jaromir Jagr, and some Stanley Cups, Sidney Crosby, obviously. So, with decent attendance and success on the court, the franchise actually moved to Minnesota in the summer of 1968, which was a little strange because, they were getting average crowds, and, the team definitely probably would have got more popular with how they were doing on the court and winning the championship,
I was curious. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but
no problem.
I was curious when you said their record. So I looked up their winning percentage or calculated it. So the NBA record for best winning percentages was the Golden State Warriors of a few years ago. Their winning percentage was .890. So the Pipers in their first season would have had a record winning percentage of .964. So wow. That's pretty incredible.
No, I mean 2 losses only. That's nuts. Really.
Yeah. But continue. Sorry to interrupt. I thought that was interesting.
That was a good interjection into this podcast. So Minnesota had so I said that the Pipers ended up moving to the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and Minnesota had a team actually in the ABA's first season. They were named the Muskies.
A fish, correct?
That's a fish, correct. So the crowds were terrible actually in the Twin Cities for the Muskies, and the franchise picked up and moved to Miami to become the Miami Floridians, which I think was the team that was loosely that semi-pro was basically loosely based on. They were the Tropics, but I think it might have been there might have been a correlation.
Only Florida would just be like, yeah, whatever. We're the Floridians. Everybody knows that we're an interesting breed of people, so we might as well be our own mascot. Exactly.
I wonder what the mascot was. Anyways, the league offices were located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the league's commissioner actually lived. So they wanted to keep a team there. And the commissioner was actually George Mikan, who was the NBA legend. He played for the Minneapolis Lakers before and won a bunch of championships before they, eventually moved to LA. So he lived in Minneapolis, and the Pipers played at the Met Center, where another NHL correlation where NHL's Minnesota North Stars used to play. The arena that they played in was actually torn down and now is a parking lot for the U.S.'s biggest mall, the Mall of America. And the Pipers' first year in Minnesota, they once again made the playoffs, but in the first round, they ended up losing to, who else? The Miami Floridians. So attendance for the Pipers was just as bad as the Muskies, the franchise that moved to become the Floridians. So they decided to move back to Pittsburgh. The co-owner at the time, Gabe Ruman, decided to move them back to Pennsylvania because he couldn't figure out anywhere else to go. The first season, actually, back in Pittsburgh, the team struggled on the court and had low fan attendance. They were soon bought by new ownership and decided to change their name and kind of revamp the franchise, get some excitement back, and see if they could draw more fans. So from the 70-71 season, the Pittsburgh franchise, they actually had to name the team contest, and the team decided on the Pittsburgh Pioneers. Pretty good name,
Yeah.
Flowed a bit, but that name hardly lasted at all because a local NAIA school, Point Park College, threatened to sue and remove the nickname.
That's just you got dominated by a NAIA college team. That is sad for a professional sports franchise.
Right. I can't imagine the school is bigger than 5,000.
You know what You know what that reminds me of, though, is when the Vegas Golden Knights first started. I think they were the Army, the U.S. Military Academy. I think gave them a hard time because they were also the Knights or the Golden Knights, and I think there was a little bit. There was a little bit of a Twitter spat. I don't remember if it was like a full on like legal issue, but there was definitely a similar situation.
Yeah, I definitely remember that. I think it got settled pretty quick, but I do remember there was a little spat for sure. So going back into, well, I guess the Pioneers, they had to change their name, obviously. So the new ownership decided on the Condors. So the fans didn't want to really get to pick the name, actually. With the new nickname, the Condors, the team still struggled on the court and failed to make the playoffs by one game. Oh. And I believe the Floridians beat them out.
Again.
Just haunting this franchise. So a crazy stunt that happened during that season, the Condors GM's name was Marty Blake. He was the current GM at that time. Made every seat that wasn't sold available in the arena to fans, so free. The tickets were free. So they gave out 11,012 tickets for free. A professional franchise.
That's brutal.
Yeah. So around 8,000 fans showed up. And obviously ownership was not amused by this at all. So Blake must have not got permission from ownership, and he was fired.
Justifiably so.
Yeah, not the best move. So the only really memorable moment of that season was when Charlie Helicopter Hentz, I believe it's Hentz, Hentz, shattered 2 backboards in one game, which is insane. I mean, I can't imagine the plexiglass is it plexiglass?
I think so. The ABA probably was cheaping out, or the that just reminds me of I always think about semi-pro when we're talking about this story, and like how Jackie Moon was always so cheap. Like whoever the owner of the Pioneers, or sorry, the Condors, probably was paying like for like $5 backboards, like made of like parchment paper, wax paper or something.
Yeah, who knows? But still pretty impressive. Mm-hmm. So the 70-71 season began with the Condors ownership wondering what they could do to get some excitement into Pittsburgh and, see if they can make some money, I guess.
In an effort to rejuvenate the Condors franchise, ownership lured defending NBA champion, the Milwaukee Bucks star player Lou Alcindor, to play in an exhibition game with the Condors. The team had to pay the Bucks $25,000 in order to make this happen. Alcindor, who we all know as now NBA legend Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, was injured right before the game, and then only about 8,000 to 9,000 fans showed up for the game, so very low attendance after much hype.
This season, as I said, had a rough start, so they ended up going 4-6 in their first 10 games, which resulted in the Condors firing their head coach. So the team was so bad, the average attendance dropped to about 1,000 fans per game.
That's brutal.
Yeah, I'm not sure how big the igloo was, but it had to be at least 15,000, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's like a typical hockey arena, basketball arena is like 15 to 17, I think, on the low end, and like mid-20s on the high end, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, so, not good crowds at all. Not much fan support there for them in Pittsburgh, but I guess it just was a bad luck franchise from the start, unfortunately, off the court. So, with these terrible crowds, the Condors ownerships during the season announced the franchise would be relocating once again, which, what a weird move to just announce that during the regular season and not when the season was completed. Okay, so like I said, the Condors struggled terribly this year as well as they did in the past, and the Condors ownership soon announced the franchise would be relocating once again during the regular season, which is absolutely ridiculous. So the team's final home games in Pittsburgh drew about, actually averaged about 690 fans. The last few games at the Civic Center, and they began playing home games in other Pennsylvania cities.
The Nomads or the Pioneers. Right. They're pioneering a new or an old barnstorming style of play.
Right. I don't know.
I keep forgetting they were called the Condors. Sorry, but they were
you
called
can call them 3 different names if you want. There's three names to choose from. So they started bounce around in Pennsylvania cities. I'm assuming they didn't go to Philadelphia because the 76ers were there, but I don't know a ton about Pennsylvania, so I don't know where else they would have played. So the Condors played their last home game in Tucson, Arizona.
Yikes.
Yeah. So ownership tried to find a more suitable market for the Condors, but failed to do so, and the franchise folded. So Pittsburgh, this franchise was unable to exist long enough to, merge into the NBA, which the ABA and NBA had a merger in 1976, where 6 teams actually joined the NBA, and that included the Denver Nuggets, the New York Nets, the Indiana Pacers, and the San Antonio Spurs. That's only 4 teams.
Coffee Black's new team from semi-pro.
There was only 6 teams in the league at this time when they merged. So there are 2 teams
didn't get
folded.
Picked. The
I think it was like
Dropics.
St. Louis, and I can't remember the other team, but
there's so many weird. I mean, there's so many weird cities back then, even in the 70s, that like professional basketball teams were located in. Like if you look at the NBA, even before that, in the 50s and 60s, it was like Fort Wayne and like Syracuse and just strange middle of nowhere
teams that just don't have really. I mean, they have college sports, but not known for. And minor league teams, I guess, but not more known for, the big leagues.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and like one of the teams that folded was I forget, maybe the St. Louis Spirit, but.
That sounds right.
Yeah. It's just interesting because, in the times since we've been alive, I don't think there's ever been professional basketball in like St. Louis or, Pittsburgh. We weren't alive during this time. So yeah, it just doesn't seem, when I think of Pittsburgh or St. Louis, I just don't see any professional basketball. I don't associate the NBA with those leagues or the ABA. But anyways, despite chaos on the court, the team had 3 future basketball Hall of Famers. Of course, Connie Hawkins was one of them. And then 2 head coaches, Buddy Jeanette and Vern Michelson. Yeah, so like I said, this franchise really struggled, at least off the court, and really could never find their footing and folded. And yeah, that's the Pittsburgh, what they start off as the Pipers, moving into the Pioneers for like a day, and then the Pittsburgh Condors. That's the history of their franchise.
Yeah, it's interesting how they kind of how they moved so much. Reminds me of the Raiders or the Rams a little bit. Like only those teams were already established, and because they're NFL teams, they had plenty of money. So it wasn't like they were fighting to survive. It was just like, although the Chargers might be, you never know.
Who knows with the Chargers, but they'll survive somehow. Who knows though?
Yeah.
So I forgot to mention though, the Pipers' first year, I said they had a 54-2 record and won the ABA championship. That was the only professional basketball championship that ever happened in Pittsburgh.
That's impressive. I mean, that's like another piece of bar trivia you could put out there. Like, what definitely. Is who won the pursuit? Like a trick question. That reminds me of this isn't really a sports question, but which city is further west, Reno or Los Angeles? Mm-hmm. People always say LA because it's on the coast, but like geographically, Reno is further west. So that's one of those trick questions.
Really?
Like, who was the only? Like who did Pittsburgh? Who was the only team to win a professional basketball championship in Pittsburgh? Nobody. Pittsburgh doesn't have an NBA team. You're
right.
wrong.
Yeah, I actually had no idea on the Reno thing either. So
yeah, it's weird. It's count on me for that useless type of trivia.
Yeah, I love useless trivia.
I am going to tell the story of Los Angeles's first professional hockey team, the Los Angeles Blades. They only they only existed for like 6 seasons, but they have not only did they have a very interesting kind of roster involved in just a 6-year existence, but they did something that changed the landscape of Los Angeles sports history pretty much forever. And I don't think people in Los Angeles or around the country really know who they are, except for huge hardcore hockey historians, let alone the impact that they had. So let's get into it.
All right.
And my sources, before I get going, so I don't forget, was one article called "No One Was Killed Outright: LA Surprising Ice Hockey History," which was a 2014 article in LA Weekly by Jim Thurman. And that cites an early LA Times article from a guy who watched the first ever hockey game, supposedly, in Los Angeles.
Okay.
There's 50 Forgotten Stories. It was almost the LA Blades, which came from a 2016 NHL.com article by Shen Peng. I found some information in a book called Ice Warriors, the Pacific Coast / Western Hockey League, 1948 to 1974 by John C. Stott. And so let's get it started. Hockey has had a long history in LA, even though really the Kings started in 1967. We'll get into that a little later. Hockey has been played in LA as far back as 1917, when the first recorded game in Los Angeles was played. And a gentleman or LA Times writer by the name of Ward Fowler covered the game, and his story headlined "Ice Hockey Introduced to Enthusiastic Fans. No one was killed outright," in quotes. The game he described sounded familiar to modern hockey. It was just as exciting and confounding to new fans. When a player, and this is what Fowler wrote directly, when a player can't think of anything else to do, he swats the bean toward the goalkeeper with all his might. If this man is lucky, he gets out of the way. If he isn't, they carry him over to one side of the rink, place him gently on his back, and tell him to keep cool until the Undertaker arrives, which
wow.
I thought it was the bean instead of the puck.
Oh, wow. Maybe they used a bean.
Yeah. I mean, it's a funny way to describe playing goalie. Just like, here, good luck, and hope you don't die.
Right.
Since then, there's been a lot of hockey played in Los Angeles, including by the University of Southern California and Loyola Marymount University, who to this day have club teams. Those two teams have a pretty strong rivalry with each other, but back then they were varsity teams. I know LMU had a player eventually go to the New York Rangers back in, this is probably the 40s, and USC as a varsity team beat the University of Minnesota Golden Gophers twice. I think this is in the 30s. Yeah. So not a lot of people know that USC once had a varsity hockey team, let alone still has a club hockey team.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. Like, it seems like hockey kind of had a deep history, many, many years ago in California, and it seems like it just kind of died until the Kings came.
Yeah. I mean, I think what happened was a lot of when the oil kind of rush or oil, they struck oil here in Southern California, a lot of people came from elsewhere. And I think a lot of Canadians came and brought the game with them. So
sure. Makes sense.
I mean, the Zamboni was invented and is still built here. So just down the road.
No idea. I had no idea on that.
Yeah. I think it's in Paramount, California. So it's
cool.
A pretty interesting, even that history alone, but let's get into the Blades. So
sure.
The first true professional team didn't arrive in LA until 1961 in the form of the Blades. The Blades are part of a league called the Western Hockey League, or the WHL, which isn't directly related to, for those hockey fans that are listening, the Western Hockey League, which is the major junior league, which is part of the CHL,
right?
That exists today. So although there's some connection, I'll get into that at the very end of the story. The WHL, which was known as the PCHL, short for the Pacific Coast Hockey League, began in 1952, but was considered an amateur league back then because the owners didn't want to pay the NHL's regional rights fee to be professional. And basically they had a monopoly back then. I think they kind of still do.
Yeah.
At one point, the PCHL, when they were amateur, included teams like the Hollywood Wolves, Fresno Falcons, Los Angeles Monarchs, Oakland Oaks, Pasadena Panthers, and San Diego Skyhawks, as well as the San Francisco Shamrocks.
Is that an all-California league?
No, I think there was a lot of teams in Canada. I think it was just a big amateur league.
Cool.
But in 1952, the PCHL absorbed a few other teams and decided to go professional. But by then, the teams in California had already either disbanded or left because they didn't want to be pro, like I said, pay the pro rights. But not long after that, Al Leader, who was the owner of the WHL, decided he wanted to attain major league status and thought that starting teams in Los Angeles and San Francisco would really help toward that goal.
Sure.
So in 1961, the WHL awarded a franchise to Los Angeles. The league moved the Victoria Cougars to LA and awarded James Piggott, who had already owned the Cougars, as well as Dan Reeves, the owner of the LA Rams in the NFL, co-ownership of the Blades.
Huh. Interesting. The Victoria Cougars, I can think of that logo. I've seen it before.
Yeah, it's like a kind
cool
of
logo.
Yeah. Talk about the old school logo guy.
Right.
So the other teams in the Blades division of the WHL were all obviously on the West Coast, including the Portland Buckaroos, which is, I think, a pretty Portland name.
Yeah, that's a cool name, actually.
Yeah. The Spokane Comets, the San Francisco Seals, and if that sounds familiar, there's a reason. They're future NHL San Francisco Golden Seals, but we'll add that detail in a little while.
All right.
The Seattle Totems. So the Seattle Totems is, I think, still a junior team up there, if I'm not mistaken.
Maybe, yeah. I think not like a major junior team, but I think
like a WSHL or one of those
something
guys.
Like that, yeah.
And then the San Diego Gulls joined actually after the Blades were finished or in their last year. And that's they don't really carry a thread through to today's AHL Gulls, but what a lot of teams will do is just take the old kind of historic team names from their region if they're not being used. So that was the first Gulls, I think. Gulls version 1. The Blades formed a natural rivalry with the San Francisco Seals. That's hard to say that 3 times fast. Who had a better success during their tenure. LA notably had 2 American college players. They also had an NHL veteran, Doug Bentley, who scored 219 goals and more than 500 NHL games for the Blackhawks Rangers.
Good career.
And then the biggest name and probably the best player in Blades history, and I'd be ventured to guess the WHL in that era, was Willie O'Ree, who most of you know sports history know that Willie O'Ree broke the NHL's color barrier when he played for the Boston Bruins in 1957-58. So,
right. I actually met Willie O'Ree years ago.
Really? What was he like?
Extremely nice man.
I mean,
very nice.
I don't think you can find a better ambassador for the sport of hockey.
Right. And he just had his birthday a few days ago. He's 85. So
yeah,
pretty cool.
Yeah, that is awesome. He is a legend for sure. And so 3 years after he broke the NHL color barrier with the Bruins, he ended up coming to the Blades. I think he played for a few games for one team in between, but his time in the NHL included 45 NHL games. He scored 4 goals and had 10 assists. His final NHL season was 1960-61, so the year before the Blades came into existence.
Mm-hmm.
In 1964-65, O'Ree led the league with the WHL with 38 goals, so pretty good tally even in today's professional hockey leagues.
Oh yeah, for sure.
In 1961-62, though, the Blades debuted before 10,000 fans, so pretty good number, losing 7-3 to Portland. The game was also broadcast on television.
No way.
Yep. Yeah. Early, 60-61. Yeah, it's like the early sports times in TV history.
Yeah,
I think.
Hockey Night in Canada existed then.
Yeah.
First games. I believe so.
Yeah. So after their first season, the Blades missed the playoffs, but San Francisco made it, so they get the first kind of early success. They did make the playoffs in their second season, but they were eliminated by the Seals of San Francisco in the first round, and then the Seals went on to win the league title that year. So really, like we talked about with the Pipers / Condors / Pioneers, really off to a good start.
Yeah. Okay.
In 1963-64, the Blades had their best season when they were coached by Alf Pike, who was their third head coach in 3 years. They went 31-31-8, but they made the playoffs the first time they made the playoffs. Or no, second time, excuse me. The finals were an all-California affair in 1963-64 between the Blades and Seals. The Seals were coached by Don Poyle, who is the father of Nashville Predators' longtime president of hockey operations, David Poyle. So some more hockey history in there.
Yeah, that's cool.
The league was obviously old school. There was a sentence in Ice Warriors that said, quote, rugged defenseman Frank Arnett fired up the Blades in Game 5 by, and I'll play the fill in the blank. What did he do?
He, let me guess, beat someone up.
Yes. Well, good knowledge of old school, rough and tumble, violent hockey. He assaulted a referee. So there we go. That
would go over really well these days.
Yeah. It would not, would be probably expulsion from the league or at least, I mean, I know it happened.
Charges, maybe.
Yeah. It did happen. We talked about this. I think it happened in the NHL within the last few years, not like outright punching the referee, but Antoine Vermette slashing a linesman was not.
I remember that. That was weird.
I'm trying to think.
He like did it. I mean, as far like watching it on TV as a fan, it looked like he slashed the ref for no reason.
Yeah,
it was weird. Like, it was strange.
So this is what I was thinking of. On January 27th, 2016, Dennis Weidman struck linesman Don Henderson from behind in a game between the Flames and Nashville Predators, where it looks like Weidman's skating to the bench and kind of goes out of his way to knock the linesman over. And that was, I don't remember what his suspension was. Yeah, he was. The suspension was 20-game suspension.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
that didn't register with me. I'm usually pretty up on those things, but the more you talk about it, I do remember now.
Yeah. All right. So we'll start this back up now.
Okay.
So you are correct. He assaulted a referee, which back then probably got him a slap on the wrist. Today, if you do it like Dennis Weidman did a few years ago, you get about a quarter of the season taken away from you. So
probably had beers with the ref after the game.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of have to. You can't leave that unsettled.
Right.
But in spite of the assault on the referee, which failed to fire up the Blades, the Seals won in 6 games. And as would be the case for most of California hockey's time here, the Blades and Seals were always second fiddle to the Giants and Dodgers of baseball.
Right.
In 1964, there were some bubblings and some rumors of the NHL expanding. So, and there was also some signals from the Blades and Seals that they wanted to join the NHL. They said they might not play in the 1964-65 season and that they would apply for NHL franchises, but the NHL told them to pound sand. They weren't interested in taking any applications from those ownership groups. So they kind of got big timed by the NHL on the first attempt.
Oh, that's too bad.
Meanwhile, the Blades and Seals the Blades especially played pretty poorly. The Seals didn't, but they still had designs on joining the NHL, so much so that the other teams didn't trust them. At that point, they agreed to pay each WHL team $40,000 if they left the league, which in that time I failed to look up what that would be now, but if you're listening, you can Google it. And then they agreed to stay in the WHL for 3 more seasons. In 1965, the NHL announces a committee to explore expansion, which sets in motion the end of the Blades. In 1966, the NHL announces the 6 cities they're going to expand into: Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Minneapolis, St. Paul, St. Louis, San Francisco, and LA.
They were included in the first wave of the NHL expansion. Yeah,
the city of Los Angeles and San Francisco. They eventually would become 2 of the 6 teams the NHL added in 1967, but we are getting there. So when that was announced, people thought the Blades ownership were early favorites to be that LA NHL franchise, but there were warning signs that might not be the case. At the time, Ken McKenzie, who's a publisher of the Hockey News, who I don't think was related to Bob McKenzie,
not sure on that,
was quoted as saying they're in last place with the biggest city in the league and their attendance hasn't been built up. To me, this points to poor management. And he was right. There would be definitely some problems, and we'll get to that. They were only averaging a few thousand fans per game at that point and had missed the playoffs in consecutive seasons. So this is where we get to what I call the civil war of hockey. And this is where most of the information I got from the ShenPengNHL.com article.
Okay.
So there were multiple different potential owners battling for the LA NHL franchise. The two biggest names that were trying to outsmart each other were Reeves, who owned by that time, I think, was the only owner of the LA Blades, and Jack Kent Cooke, who was the owner of the LA Lakers.
Huh.
So they were also competing against Ralph Wilson, the owner of the Buffalo Bills, whose name was formerly on the Buffalo Bills Stadium until just a couple of years ago.
New Era Stadium, I believe now.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. So no longer Ralph Wilson, but if his name sounds familiar,
it does.
He was one of the ones competing for the LA NHL franchise.
Oh, that's crazy.
And then Tony Owen, who was a TV producer here in LA. And this is where the trickery and the shrewd sports management and business negotiating got started. The Blades had partnered with the Coliseum Commission, who owned the LA Sports Arena. And at the LA Sports Arena was the Blades' home. That's where they played all their home games. So basically, the Blades signed an agreement with the sports arena, extending their lease and saying that no other professional teams could play there, which was a problem for the other bidders because besides the LA Sports Arena, there was really only the Long Beach Sports Arena that could really house a professional team, but they were kind of old and not in the best shape. On top of that, they eliminated one of their opponents, not in Frank Arnett or whatever his name's way was of assaulting them. They basically made him team president. So they made him part of their ownership group and trimmed down 4 competitors to 3.
Okay.
But this didn't work. Unfortunately, Jack Kent Cooke was like, well, if you won't let me play my hockey, if you won't let my team play their hockey at your stadium, we're just going to build our own. And at the time, it sounded like people were skeptical that he would do that, but he did. He went forward. The progress apparently looked so good that the LA City Council basically told the Coliseum Commission, listen, Jack Kent Cooke is going to get this done. He's not going to get it done in time to start playing when the NHL wants to play. So you have to renege on your agreement with the Blades to not let other professional teams play. So that's what happened. Basically, the Coliseum Commission was like, sorry, no more agreement. And before that happened, when it looked like the Blades were the favorite, the other WHL teams had promised to send them like 2 of their best players so they could be more competitive.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The WHL teams were like, nope, sorry, no dice. So those 2 things combined made it pretty unlikely.
Yeah.
So basically they awarded the team to Jack Kent Cooke. So Kings played their first game at the Long Beach Sports Arena, and then they played a few games there and the rest of their games until December at the LA Sports Arena, former home of the Blades. Jack Kent Cooke finished his stadium, and that stadium became none other than the Great Western Forum, which was home to the Lakers and the Kings for, let's see, a good 30-ish years at that point.
And it's still there hosting concerts.
Yeah, it's still there hosting concerts. It's now a COVID testing site. And once Staples Center came along, obviously Staples took over. But I mean,
I'm really surprised that the Kings basically, the arena seems like it was built for them and not the Lakers. And obviously the Lakers are one of the most popular franchises in the world. But
I think it's an example of hockey, and I think we'll get into this in further episodes, how hockey kind of helped grow basketball in some ways. Like hockey was the bigger sport back then, I think. More commercially viable, I guess. They had started their professional leagues earlier, and back then the professional basketball was played, like we said, in small cities and in small venues. And the LA Blades, the small, seemingly insignificant now in our time, minor league hockey team, basically indirectly caused Jack Kent Cooke to build directly caused him to build the Great Western Forum, which became the backdrop for the Lakers dynasty and for Wayne Gretzky coming to LA and bringing hockey.
Ton of success there.
Yeah, like the Miracle on Manchester. It's named the Miracle on Manchester because the Forum is on Manchester Boulevard or Avenue. As an LA resident, I feel I'm kicking myself for not knowing whether I think it's Manchester Ave. Yeah. And legendary concerts being held there. So yeah, that was basically the genesis of the Great Western Forum. The Blades' legacy carried on in other ways as well. The Saskatoon Blades, which are the team in the now current Western Hockey League, the Major Junior League, which is a feeder league for the NHL. For those who don't really know, it's like the NCAA basketball equivalent of for the NBA. Only it's not an educational league.
And kids get paid, so it makes them ineligible to play NCAA hockey. That's kind of
a weird, like, contentious point. The WHL and the Canadian Hockey League would probably like you to think that they're not professionals, but the NCAA considers them professionals. So,
right.
So that really not important for this, but the Saskatoon Blades, aside from having their name, also in their first couple seasons use their jerseys. So if you look at the Blades kind of logo and branding in Saskatoon, it's very similar to the LA Blades because it was a feeder team. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, some history that still exists.
I think it's kind of almost like Rams colors.
Yeah, Rams, Lakers-ish colors. Yeah. And then finally, the last legacy for the Blades, which I think is pretty cool. And I, to be honest, don't know if this is the case, but there is basically a beer league team called the Los Angeles Blades, but it's there was a pro roller hockey team in between in the 90s, but
the RHI? That league?
I think so.
Or the Pro Beach Hockey League?
I think the RHI. I didn't look that up either, but some 90s, some crazy, wild, wacky sport.
Yeah.
But the current LA Blades are a gay and lesbian beer league team that plays in various leagues around Los Angeles. I think they have a lower division team in the league that we play in. I've seen them walking around the rink.
Sure.
But they've been around for a long time, since 1985, and their self-described mission statement is to provide a safe and welcoming environment for LGBT and straight people to play the game of hockey and to help build understanding and eliminate homophobia in the hockey community. So, I mean, the fact that they've been doing that since 85 is incredible. And so that is it. And if you are interested in and like I said, I haven't contacted anybody with the Blades. So, but if you are interested in learning more about the LA Blades current team, the LGBT team, it's www.bladeshockey.com. And that'll be it for the LA Blades history. Anything you want to add?
No, it like I said, it's something that just what they created from being, a struggling franchise, like, the connection to the Saskatoon Blades, and also locally the LA Blades LGBT community team. So that team, existing since 1985 is pretty cool. And, even, starting the Kings, they had a role in starting the Kings, and then also the success of the Lakers. Who knows what would happen? Would the Lakers move from Minneapolis? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I think they did.
I think that happened a long time ago.
They moved before that, yeah. That's okay.
They moved in like the 20s, probably.
We're keeping this in. It's like a whale's vagina. That's like the Ron Burgundy, named by the Irish in 1957.
Like George Mikan is probably, he's obviously dead, but he's probably like 150 at this point.
Yeah, no worries. So, Andrew, is there anywhere before we close out that people can follow you on Twitter or social media, anywhere they can read your work?
Yeah, I have a Twitter account at AWLENN. AWLEN.
Awesome. And you can find me on Twitter at Deli Tweets. That's DELLITWEETS. And feel free to send us any sort of teams you might want us to research and tell the story of, or any stories you have about these teams. We'll be happy to talk about them on the podcast. And please rate us on iTunes and any sort of podcast system, your podcast, whatever medium you listen to us on. We'd love to get more listeners. Tell your friends. And that'll be it. Stay tuned for the next episode.